The sun was setting over the small, dusty POW camp in the middle of America. The sky glowed orange, but the camp felt cold and gray. Rows of wooden barracks stretched along the field, and the barbed wire fences glinted under the fading light. Inside, the Japanese prisoners of war moved quietly, their faces tired and weary. Many of them had never been outside Japan before. Now they were far from home in a strange land with nothing familiar around them. They whispered among themselves in low voices, their eyes filled with curiosity and fear. The guards had been strange to them from the beginning, stern men who followed rules without question. Food had always been basic and strange, often tasteless and unfamiliar. Every day the prisoners longed for a taste of something real, something that reminded them of home. But today something unusual was happening. The guards were carrying a strange package across the camp. It was small but heavy, wrapped in brown paper, and it smelled different. The scent made the prisoners pause. They sniffed the air cautiously, wondering if it was even food at all. Some looked at each other with wide eyes. "What is that?" whispered one young soldier, barely above a breath. "No idea," said another, shaking his head. "Maybe it is medicine, or worse, something for the guards." The guards placed the package on a wooden table in the center of the camp. They stepped back, arms crossed, watching closely. The prisoners gathered slowly, their steps quiet but filled with anticipation. The package seemed ordinary, but to these men, it was completely unknown. One of the older prisoners, a man named Sato, stepped forward. He had lived through many battles, seen his friends fall, and endured hunger and fear. But even he looked nervous now. His eyes were fixed on the package, and he could feel the other men watching him. He slowly bent down, touched the brown paper, and looked up at the guards. "Is this food?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The question hung in the air. The guards did not answer. Instead, one of them gave a small nod. That was all. Sato's heart raced. He carefully lifted the paper, and beneath it, he saw something he had never imagined. It was round, small, and smelled warm and delicious. The prisoners leaned closer, trying to see. Some covered their mouths with their hands. Their eyes grew wider. It was something strange, something completely foreign to them. None of them had ever seen anything like it. One prisoner whispered, "What is that?" The smell was strong, sweet, and smoky at the same time. It made their stomachs growl, and for a moment, all the fear and anger of the camp melted away. Curiosity took over. Hunger mixed with excitement. But still no one dared touch it first. Sato slowly lifted it in his hands. It was soft but not too soft. Warm but not too hot. His fingers trembled. The other prisoners watched him closely. Every second seemed longer than the last. He looked at the guards, who stood silently, their faces unreadable. Then he looked down at the strange food in his hands. The other prisoners whispered again. Some held their breath. Some shook their heads, unsure if they should even watch. It was a simple meal, but to them, it was mysterious, almost magical. Sato took a small bite. Just one. The taste exploded in his mouth. It was sweet, salty, and savory all at once. His eyes widened. He could not believe what he was tasting. His lips trembled. He swallowed slowly, unsure what to do next. He had never experienced anything like this in his life. Then something unexpected happened. A tear rolled down his cheek. One tear. Then another. He could not stop. The other prisoners gasped, not expecting this reaction. The taste was simple, but it awakened memories of home, of family, of warmth and comfort. It was a flavor that made them realize how much they had missed life outside the camp. Some prisoners started crying quietly. Others stared at the food in disbelief. A young soldier named Hiroshi could hardly speak. He whispered, "It tastes like home." And for the first time since arriving at the camp, the prisoners felt something close to happiness. The guards watched silently, some curious, some surprised. They had not expected such a reaction. To them it was just food. But to the POWs it was more than that. It was a reminder that life could still hold small joys, even in the darkest times. Sato looked around at his friends. They were all different now, curious, nervous, but also hopeful. No one knew what this food was called or why it was here or if they would ever taste it again. But at that moment the camp felt a little less heavy, a little less lonely. The camera of the story would linger on the package, on the simple yet powerful food that had caused so much emotion. The prisoners gathered closer, and one whispered almost to himself, "What happens next will shock everyone." And with that, the story hung in suspense, leaving everyone waiting to see how this small, strange meal could change the lives of men who had never imagined such a simple pleasure in the middle of war. The morning sun barely touched the barbed wire fences of the POW camp, Yet the small group of Japanese prisoners was already awake. The strange package from the day before still sat on the wooden table, but now the prisoners could see it more clearly. The smell lingered in the air, and even though the guards had not brought anything new, the memory of that one bite haunted them. Sato, the older prisoner, stood near the table. He was quiet, thoughtful, and still tasting the strange flavors in his mind. He had never imagined that a simple piece of food could make him cry. Around him, the younger men whispered nervously. They could not stop thinking about what had happened yesterday. Hiroshi, the young soldier who had whispered, "It tastes like home," took a hesitant step toward the table. His hands shook slightly. He looked at Sato, then at the others, and finally at the strange food wrapped in paper. I want to try it again," he said softly. Sato nodded slowly. "Careful. Take it slowly. Don't rush it." The other prisoners gathered around, forming a small circle. They all stared at the strange round food. None of them had words. Their curiosity was mixed with fear. What if it was poisoned? What if it was dangerous? But the smell was too strong, too tempting. Their stomachs growled quietly, betraying their courage. One of the younger men, Tanaka, finally reached out. His fingers brushed the warm bread and he pulled it closer. He held it up, examining it like a precious treasure. "It smells good," he whispered, almost afraid to say it too loud. Sato watched him carefully. "Remember," he said, "don't let your hunger control you. Taste it slowly. Feel it." Hiroshi took the first small bite. His eyes closed, and for a moment he forgot everything: the camp, the fences, the guards. It was a new world of taste, warm and strange. His lips trembled. He could feel something in his chest, deep inside him, something he had not felt since leaving Japan. The others watched him with wide eyes. Some were curious, some were scared. And then, slowly, Sato lifted the piece of food in his hands and took a bite. His eyes widened and he swallowed slowly. One tear rolled down his cheek. The prisoners were shocked. They had seen tears before, but never over food. It was strange, almost impossible. Why would food make someone cry? But Sato did not stop. The taste seemed to awaken memories of home, of family, of long-lost meals with loved ones. Tanaka followed next, carefully taking a small bite. His hands shook. His eyes watered. He swallowed quickly, then looked around at the others. It tastes like life," he whispered. The young soldiers could hardly believe it. Something as simple as a piece of food, something they had never seen before, could make them feel so many emotions. They laughed quietly, some nervously. They cried quietly, some softly. And still they could not stop tasting it, wanting more, afraid to finish it too quickly. The guards watched silently from a distance. They had expected nothing more than a simple meal for the prisoners. They did not expect this. They did not expect tears. They did not expect laughter. They did not expect the prisoners to look at each other with wonder and curiosity, as if they had discovered a secret world. Sato took another bite and closed his eyes. The taste was warm, salty, sweet, and comforting. He remembered the smell of his mother's kitchen, the laughter of his sister, the feeling of being home. And suddenly he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. Hiroshi reached out for another bite. His friends hesitated, but finally each one took the food carefully, one small piece at a time. They tasted it slowly, savoring every moment. Some whispered words of surprise. Some laughed quietly. Some cried silently. It was a symphony of emotions, a mix of joy and sadness. The air in the camp had changed. The tension that had always been there, the fear, the loneliness, the constant worry, was replaced with something new. Curiosity, hope, and even a sense of connection among the prisoners. They shared the strange food carefully, helping each other. No one rushed. They understood, even in this small moment, that life could be more than suffering. Sato looked around at his friends. He saw the young soldiers' faces filled with wonder. He saw their eyes sparkle for the first time in months. And he realized something important. This simple meal, this strange and foreign food, had reminded them of their humanity. It had reminded them that even in the darkest place, there was something to feel, to enjoy, and to remember. The guards, still observing, exchanged looks. They could not understand the depth of emotion they were witnessing, but they knew something extraordinary was happening. A simple act, a single meal, had changed the mood of the camp completely. And then, as the prisoners took their last bites, a quiet hush fell over the group. They looked at each other, smiling softly. No words were needed. The strange food had done more than fill their stomachs, it had touched their hearts. Sato whispered, almost to himself, "Who would have thought food could feel like this?" And for the first time in a long while, the prisoners of war felt a sense of life beyond the fences, beyond the guards, and beyond the endless days of fear and uncertainty. The camera would linger on the empty plate, the soft glow of the sun, and the prisoners' tearful, smiling faces. And the story waited, just as the prisoners did, for what would come next. Because this was only the beginning. Something small had happened, something simple and extraordinary. But what happened next would shock everyone. The camp was unusually quiet that morning. The prisoners sat in small groups, still holding pieces of the strange, warm food that had changed their world in just one bite. The memory of the first taste lingered like a dream. Some stared at the empty plates as if the food had vanished too soon. Some wiped their eyes, still surprised at the tears that had escaped without warning. Sato, the older prisoner, leaned against the wooden barracks, thinking. He had seen war in its most brutal form, destruction, fear, and loss, but nothing had ever touched him like this simple meal. A burger, as the guards called it, had broken through the walls of pain and hunger, and for the first time he felt something like hope. Hiroshi sat nearby, staring at the sunlight dancing across the camp. He remembered his mother, her gentle hands shaping rice balls in the kitchen, the way she would hum softly while cooking. The taste of the strange American food had unlocked memories he had buried deep inside. Memories of warmth, family, laughter, things he thought he would never feel again. A tear ran down his cheek and he quickly wiped it away. Around them, other prisoners whispered quietly. Tanaka was holding the burger paper in his hands, almost afraid to fold it. He said nothing, but his eyes were wide with emotion. Every bite had been more than food, it had been a reminder that life still had small joys, even in the middle of suffering. The guards were watching silently from a distance. One of them, a tall man with a sharp face, had seen many prisoners in his time, but he had never seen anything like this. To him, food was just food. But now he could see the prisoners trembling with emotion. They were not only hungry, they were human. The realization made him pause and he shifted uncomfortably. Sato stood and walked slowly to the center of the camp. He lifted his hand, holding the empty paper that had once held the burger. The young soldiers watched him, waiting. We never had food like this, he said softly, almost whispering. It is more than taste. It feels like something we lost. Hiroshi took a small step forward. It reminds me of home, he said quietly. I haven't thought about home in months. But now, he paused, trying to hold back the tears. I feel it again. A hush fell over the prisoners. Even the guards were silent, unsure what to do or say. The camp had never felt like this before. The walls of fear and anger seemed thinner somehow. The prisoners looked at each other, sharing a moment of understanding that did not need words. Tanaka finally spoke, his voice trembling. It is strange, he said. We are at war. We are enemies. But this food, it makes us feel something different. Sato nodded slowly. Yes. It reminds us that we are more than soldiers. We are people. People who feel, who remember, who hope. The prisoners looked at the empty table, the package that had brought them such an unexpected gift. They could not understand why the guards had given them this strange food, but for now it did not matter. What mattered was the feeling it had left behind, warmth, connection, and a spark of humanity. Hiroshi glanced at the guards. For the first time he saw curiosity in their eyes, not just suspicion. The guards seemed surprised by the prisoners' emotions. They had not expected tears. They had not expected smiles. And they had certainly not expected laughter. Soft, nervous, but laughter nonetheless. The day wore on, but the memory of that first taste stayed with the prisoners. They whispered to each other about their families, about home, about food they had long forgotten. One prisoner remembered the smell of miso soup. Another remembered the taste of grilled fish from a small village market. And slowly, quietly, the camp began to feel less like a place of despair and more like a place where life could still exist, even in the harshest conditions. Sato looked around at his friends, at the young soldiers who had once seemed so afraid, so broken. Now they were smiling softly, sharing small bites, remembering things they thought they had lost. He realized that this simple act, this small taste of food, had done something extraordinary. It had reminded them that even in a world full of war and pain, there could still be moments of beauty, moments of life, moments of hope. The guards, standing at a distance, could not understand fully, but they could see it. The camp was different now. The prisoners were different. Something had shifted, a subtle, powerful change that could not be measured in words or actions. As the sun began to set, the prisoners gathered around the table once more, sharing small pieces of the remaining food. They laughed quietly, they cried quietly, and they talked about home and life. It was a strange, quiet celebration, a moment of connection that went beyond words. Sato looked at the sky, at the fading light, and whispered almost to himself, perhaps even in war there is a chance for something good. And as the camera of the story would linger on their faces, the tears, the smiles, the soft laughter, the audience could feel the depth of emotion. These men, once defined only by their roles in a war far from home, had discovered something unexpected. Something that reminded them that they were human, that life was still there, waiting in the smallest, simplest forms. A taste, a smell, a memory. And the story held one more promise. This was only the beginning. What would happen next? How would this strange food continue to change the prisoners? And what would the guards think when they saw the effects of this simple act of kindness? The suspense hung in the air, thick and powerful, leaving everyone waiting for the next part. The camp was unusually quiet that afternoon. The sun shone harshly on the barbed wire fences, casting long shadows over the rows of wooden barracks. The prisoners sat in small groups, still tasting the strange food that had changed their morning. But this time the focus shifted to the guards. They stood at a distance, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the unusual scene. Sergeant Miller, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had been in the army for over a decade, watched with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. He had seen hundreds of prisoners in his career, but he had never seen men react to food like this. They were crying, laughing softly, whispering to each other with expressions he could not read. "What's happening here?" asked Corporal Davis, standing beside him. His brow was furrowed, his hands gripping the fence. "They're smiling? And crying? Over food." Miller shook his head slowly. "I don't understand it either," he said. "It's just a simple meal. A hamburger. But something about it, it's different. Look at them. They're human again." The guards had always seen the prisoners as numbers, as part of the war machine. Enemy soldiers. People who were distant, different, and dangerous. But now Miller noticed the soft expressions, the quiet laughter, the tears. They were not dangerous, they were vulnerable. And in that moment, the soldiers realized that the line between enemy and human was thinner than they had ever imagined. As the prisoners shared the remaining pieces, Sato stood and spoke softly. His voice carried across the camp. We have not felt this in a long time. Food, it brings us memories. It reminds us of home, of family, of life before war." The guards exchanged glances. They had not expected words like these. They had not expected sincerity, vulnerability, or honesty. It was strange, almost uncomfortable for them. They had been trained to see prisoners as enemies. Now they were seeing them as men. Real men with real feelings. Corporal Davis shifted uncomfortably. Why does food make them like this?" he asked quietly. "It's just bread and meat. That's it." Miller sighed, his eyes softening. "Sometimes," he said, "it's not the food itself. It's what it represents. Hope, life, memories. They've been trapped here, far from everything they know. And now, this small thing reminds them of who they are." The guards continued to watch in silence. Some of them felt uneasy. Some felt a strange warmth. They were supposed to be distant, supposed to enforce rules without emotion. But now they felt something different. Compassion, curiosity, even respect. Miller walked closer to the fence, keeping a careful distance from the prisoners. He saw Hiroshi holding the empty paper that had wrapped the food, staring at it as if it were a treasure. Tanaka wiped tears from his eyes, smiling softly at Sato. The sight was quiet but powerful. It made Miller pause and think about life, about humanity, about the absurdity of war. One of the younger guards, Private Lewis, whispered to his friend, "Do you think they'll ever get something like this again?" "I don't know," replied the friend. "But I think it changed them. Something small, something simple, and yet it's powerful." Sato stepped forward again, gathering the remaining scraps. We are thankful," he said. This means more than you can imagine. In a place like this, it is easy to forget life. But you reminded us." The guards felt a strange shift in the air. The prisoners were no longer just soldiers to be guarded. They were people, with hearts, with memories, with emotions that could reach across the fences and touch anyone. Miller looked at the prisoners and realized that in war, it was rare to see humanity so openly displayed. "Perhaps, food isn't just food," he muttered quietly. "Perhaps it's a bridge between people." As the day wore on, the guards found themselves observing more closely, listening more carefully. They noticed small gestures, the gentle way Sato handed a piece to a younger prisoner, the soft laughter shared between friends, the quiet wiping of tears. It was all small, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. But Miller and his men noticed. And slowly they began to understand. The camp was changing. Not through orders or force but through something far smaller and more human. The guards realized that a single act, a gift of food, a small piece of kindness, could shift the mood, could soften hearts, could make enemies see each other as humans. Miller looked at his men and whispered almost to himself, "War teaches hate. But sometimes it also teaches something else. Compassion. Understanding." The sun began to set over the camp, casting long shadows over the barracks and fences. The prisoners continued talking softly, sharing memories and tasting the strange food once more. The guards stood silently, realizing that today, nothing was ordinary. Everything had changed. And as the camera of the story would linger over the faces of both prisoners and guards, the tears, the smiles, the quiet curiosity, the audience could feel the subtle power of a small act. A hamburger had done what war could not. It had reminded men on both sides of their shared humanity. The suspense lingered. The prisoners had tasted life again, but what would come next? How would the guards react tomorrow? And how would this small, powerful moment ripple through the camp in ways no one could predict? The story held its breath. And so did the audience, waiting for the next chapter of this remarkable, emotional journey. The next morning the camp seemed different. The sun rose slowly over the wooden barracks, casting warm light across the dusty ground. The prisoners moved more slowly than usual, but their steps were lighter, more careful. Something had changed overnight, a small shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Sato walked quietly toward the empty table where the mysterious food had been. The brown paper wrapper lay folded neatly on the wooden surface, a small reminder of the day before. He touched it gently, almost as if it were fragile, and breathed in the faint lingering scent. The taste had been so simple, yet it had awakened memories he thought were long buried. Around him, the other prisoners began to gather. Hiroshi, Tanaka, and the younger men sat in small circles, sharing whispers, soft laughter, and occasional tears. The memory of the strange food still held them captive. And now it was no longer just the taste, it was the stories, the emotions, the human connections that had begun to emerge. Sato cleared his throat. Yesterday was strange, wasn't it? His voice was soft but carried across the small circle. We tasted something new. And yet it felt familiar. Like home. Hiroshi nodded slowly. Yes. I never thought a simple food could make me remember so much. My mother, she used to cook rice every morning. And I never thought I would miss it so much. His eyes glistened. He paused, then smiled softly, but this American food, it reminded me. Tanaka leaned forward. It's strange, he said. We are at war. We fight against them. But today we can sit, talk, even laugh. I never thought this would be possible. Sato smiled faintly. It is strange. But maybe war is not everything. Maybe there is something else we can feel, even here. As they spoke, the guards watched quietly from a distance. Miller, the sergeant, felt a strange mix of surprise and curiosity. He had never seen prisoners bond like this, not over weapons, not over words of anger, but over something as simple as food and memories. He could feel a new layer of understanding forming, a bridge between the men he had been taught to see as enemies and the humans he was beginning to see before him. Meanwhile, inside the circle, the prisoners began to share more stories. One spoke of the markets in his hometown, the smell of fresh fish and sweet pastries. Another remembered the sound of children playing in the streets, laughing and running, the same sound he had not heard in months. They laughed softly at the memories, sometimes covering their mouths to hide tears. Hiroshi spoke again, his voice small but strong. It is strange to feel this way about food. About memories. I thought war would take everything. But now I see that even here we can remember. We can feel. We can share. Sato nodded. Yes. And this small meal, it gave us permission to remember. To feel. To be human. The younger prisoners looked at each other with wide eyes. They had never spoken so freely, never shared their memories so openly. The fear of punishment, of anger, of ridicule, seemed to have melted away in the warmth of their shared experience. They were connecting in a way that had been impossible before, forming bonds not through survival, but through memory, emotion, and simple human kindness. Even the guards could not ignore it. Miller noticed that some of his men were leaning closer, listening. The younger guards whispered among themselves, unsure if they should intervene. But they did not. Something about the scene felt important. Sacred even. Sato looked at the empty wrapper again. It is funny, he said softly. A simple meal can teach so much. About life. About hope. About friendship even in a place like this. Hiroshi smiled faintly. Yes. Even with war we can find small joys. Even with enemies we can feel connected. Tanaka laughed softly. Maybe we could share more meals like this. Not just one. We could talk more. Learn from each other. Teach each other. The idea was new and strange. Sharing, learning, bonding, it went against everything they had been told about prisoners and guards. Yet, in that moment it seemed possible. It seemed real. Sato looked toward the guards. They watch us, he said quietly. And yet, they do not stop us. Maybe they see what we see. Maybe they feel it too. Miller, standing in the distance, nodded slowly. The sergeant had seen many things in his life, but this was different. He realized that a single act of kindness, a meal, a small taste of comfort, could ripple far beyond what anyone could imagine. It could teach understanding. Could teach connection. As the prisoners continued to share stories and memories, the camp seemed to change around them. The walls of fear, anger, and mistrust softened. Laughter, quiet and nervous at first, filled the air. The guards, silently observing, began to feel a strange warmth. Perhaps even they had forgotten that life was more than orders, discipline, and war. Perhaps even they could remember what it felt like to be human. The sun climbed higher in the sky, shining on the small groups of men sharing stories, sharing memories, sharing small smiles. And as the camera of the story would linger over the faces of both prisoners and guards, the audience could see the subtle magic of connection. The same food that had started as a strange meal had now become a bridge of memory, of hope, and of understanding. And as the day slowly faded into afternoon, a new sense of suspense and anticipation hung in the air. What would come next? How far could this connection go? Could a simple meal really change the hearts of men in the middle of a war? The story waited. And so did the audience. The camp woke slowly the next morning. The air was crisp, the sun golden over the barracks, and even the barbed wire seemed less harsh, as if softened by the small, extraordinary moments of the past days. The prisoners moved with a quiet energy, their steps lighter than usual. Something had changed in them, and in the camp itself. Sato sat near the wooden table where the strange meal had first arrived. The empty wrapper still lay there, a small relic of a day that had shifted everything. He remembered the taste, the warmth, the strange combination of flavors that had made him cry, laugh, and feel alive again. But more than that, he remembered the emotions, the shared glances, the whispered memories, the soft laughter among men who had once seemed broken and hopeless. Hiroshi joined him, holding a small scrap of bread he had saved from yesterday. He looked at Sato and whispered, "I never thought something so small could mean so much. A taste, a memory, it has changed something inside me." Sato nodded. "Yes, I feel it too. We have been prisoners, yes, but for the first time I feel alive. Not just alive but connected. Connected to each other, and even to them." He gestured subtly toward the guards, who were watching quietly from a distance. The guards had noticed the shift as well. Sergeant Miller walked slowly along the perimeter, observing the prisoners. Something had changed in the camp. There was less tension, less fear, and a strange sense of calm. The prisoners were more cooperative, more open, even smiling softly at one another. It was subtle, but Miller knew it was real. Corporal Davis, standing beside him, frowned slightly. "It's strange. A meal and now they're like this? They're different, happier, more human." Miller nodded slowly. "Yes, food was just the beginning. Something small can grow. And sometimes even the smallest act can change people and places." Back inside the camp, the prisoners gathered in small circles, sharing memories of home, of family, of life before war. They talked about simple things, a mother's cooking, the smell of rice, the sound of children playing in a village street. They laughed quietly, sometimes covering their mouths to hide tears. Each story made the bond stronger, each shared memory a thread connecting them to each other in a way that had never been possible before. Hiroshi leaned toward Tanaka and whispered, "Do you feel it too? The way we are together now?" Tanaka nodded, his eyes shining. "Yes, something has changed. I don't feel so alone anymore. I think we all feel it. Even Sato. Even the young ones. We are not just prisoners. We are people." Even the guards could feel it. They watched silently, some shifting uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Yet they understood the truth. They were witnessing something extraordinary. A simple meal, shared with care, had reminded men of their humanity. It had softened hearts, built bridges, and created moments of connection that war could never destroy. Sato stood and looked around at his friends. This "This is not just about food," he said softly. "It is about life. About hope. About remembering that even in the darkest places, we are still human. And humanity, it survives even here." The younger soldiers nodded, holding scraps of memory, laughter, and hope in their hearts. They felt it in their chests, a warm, quiet sensation that made them smile softly. For the first time in months, maybe years, they felt a sense of normalcy, a glimpse of life beyond the camp, beyond the fences, beyond the fear. Miller noticed the change too. The prisoners were more cooperative, more thoughtful, and even kinder to each other. They had begun to take small steps toward understanding, not just of the guards but of life itself. The camp atmosphere, though still guarded and tense, had softened in subtle ways. Smiles lingered longer. Conversations lasted a little more. Laughter, quiet and soft, floated through the air. Even the smallest gestures were different. A prisoner would offer a piece of bread to another. A guard would nod silently instead of barking orders. The world inside the camp was shifting, slowly, quietly, as if the taste of that strange food had opened a door that had been long closed. Sato watched the young soldiers playing a small game of cards, laughing softly, teasing each other. He felt a strange, quiet hope growing in his chest. Maybe the world could be better, even in a place filled with war. Maybe small acts, small kindnesses could change hearts. Hiroshi leaned against the table and smiled faintly. "Do you think we will ever taste this again?" he asked. Sato looked at him, his eyes soft. "I don't know. But it doesn't matter. What matters is what it taught us. That even here, even now, we can feel, we can share, we can hope. And maybe that is enough." As the sun began to set, the camp glowed in warm light. The prisoners and guards both paused, taking in the quiet beauty of the moment. For a brief, perfect instant, war seemed far away, replaced by something stronger, something enduring, humanity, connection, and hope. And as the camera would linger on the soft smiles, the gentle laughter, the lingering glances between prisoners and guards, the audience would feel the depth of the transformation. The meal had done more than feed their bodies. It had nourished their hearts, healed invisible wounds, and reminded them that even in darkness, light could exist. But the story was not over. This small miracle had set the stage for the final moments, the part where the prisoners' experience would leave a mark that none of them would ever forget. The anticipation hung in the air, thick and quiet, as everyone waited for the last chapter. The morning sun rose over the POW camp one last time, casting golden light over the wooden barracks and the tall barbed wire fences. But today felt different. There was a quiet energy in the air, a sense that something important had happened, and something more was about to unfold. Sato walked slowly to the empty table where the mysterious meal had first arrived. The brown paper wrapper still lay there, folded neatly, a small reminder of the extraordinary days that had passed. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, feeling the memories, the taste, the warmth, the shared laughter, and even the tears. Around him, the other prisoners gathered. Hiroshi, Tanaka, and the younger soldiers sat in small circles, their faces calm but glowing with quiet joy. They remembered the first bite, the strange emotions, and the stories of home they had shared over the past days. Something had changed inside them, something that could never be taken away even in the midst of war. The guards stood at a distance, observing quietly. Sergeant Miller's face was calm, but his eyes held a soft understanding. He had seen a transformation happen before him, one that could not be measured in rules or orders. The prisoners had discovered something stronger than fear or anger. They had discovered humanity. Sato lifted his head and spoke softly but with strength. "We have lived in fear. We have fought in war. We have been far from home, far from our families. But this simple meal, it reminded us of who we are. That we are human. That life exists even in places like this." Hiroshi smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "We laughed. We cried. We remembered home. And we shared these memories, with each other. Even with them." He gestured subtly toward the guards. "Even with those who guard us." Tanaka nodded. "I never thought I could feel connected like this. Not in a place like this. But now, I see it. Even here, there is hope." Miller felt a lump in his throat. He had never expected to feel this way. The prisoners were not enemies now, they were people just like him, just like his men. And somehow he understood something that went beyond orders, beyond duty, beyond war. The prisoners gathered the last scraps of the meal, careful and respectful, as if handling treasure. They shared quietly, helping each other, laughing softly, wiping tears from each other's faces. There was no fear, no anger, Only gratitude, understanding, and a quiet sense of peace that had grown from a single act of kindness. Sato looked toward the horizon, where the sun burned gold and pink across the sky. Perhaps, he whispered, even in war we can find moments like this. Moments where life wins, where kindness wins, where hope lives, even in the darkest places. Hiroshi leaned against him, smiling softly. It is strange. One simple meal, and it changed everything. We are no longer just prisoners. We are people who remember, who feel, who care. And perhaps, that is stronger than anything else. The guards, standing quietly at a distance, began to nod. Miller stepped forward carefully, his voice soft. You, all of you, have reminded us that even in a place filled with war we are still human. This small act has changed us too. The prisoners turned their heads, surprised. The guards were speaking not with orders, not with authority, but with honesty, with respect. A small connection had been made, a bridge between two sides that were supposed to be enemies. Sato took a deep breath, looking at each of the men around him. Perhaps someday far from here we will taste something like this again. But even if we do not, we will remember. We will remember the taste, and we will remember the feeling. That even in the hardest times, there is hope. There is kindness. There is life. Hiroshi smiled faintly, a single tear running down his cheek. And maybe one day we will share it again. Not just with food but with our hearts. With understanding. With humanity. The sun dipped lower, painting the camp in warm colors. The prisoners and guards stood quietly, some smiling, some wiping tears. A gentle breeze rustled through the barracks, carrying with it a sense of calm, of completion, and of quiet triumph. The story had come full circle, from fear to curiosity, from hunger to memory, from isolation to connection. Sato looked down at the empty wrapper one last time. It was just food, he said softly. But it was also more than that. It reminded us who we are. And maybe, just maybe, it reminded us what it means to be alive. The camera would linger on the faces of the prisoners, the soft smiles of the guards, the empty table and the glowing sunset. And as the story fades, the audience could feel the depth of emotion, the human heart, the power of small acts, and the enduring spark of hope that even war cannot extinguish. And in that quiet, glowing moment the story ends, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the simplest things, a meal, a memory, a shared smile, can change lives forever.